You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
And joining me now on the Hazard Ground Podcast, we are very honored and pleasured to have him here with us. He is Staff Sergeant John Diem. And John, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for your time.
All right, so your story is a very interesting one, and there is so many things to get to here. Obviously, you played a huge part in what happened in 2006 in Yusufiyah, Mahmudiyah, and you know the bad things that came out of there. But there is more to your career than that, and I really would like to dive into that. And so the first question we always ask everybody on the podcast is, well, just tell us why you joined. Why did you sign up for the military?
Well, I mean, I thought that I'd like to do something where my job would be different every day. I wanted some structure, and I wanted to learn a skill set and kind of go on an adventure.
When you say learn a different skill set and go on an adventure, I mean, did you feel like the Army was the one place that you can do that? There are a lot of other careers out there that can kind of give you a variety and things of that nature.
Well, I mean, like first responder type stuff, if you're talking about adventure, like, which is like taking your own life into your hands, like having an outside impact, you know what I mean? Service is really the only way to go. I mean, sure, like you can make a difference, like going into politics or law or any number of things, but it's just not the same as like pulling somebody out of a burning building or tourniqueting somebody's injury, you know?
No, I understand. So how old were you when you decided to enlist?
I was 17.
Still in high school?
Yep, and enlisted straight out of high school.
What did your parents say when you told them you were going to join?
They were pretty excited about me joining military service. The problem was I decided to go infantry, and that's when they kind of were a little less enthusiastic.
Why? Well, again, what year was this when you were doing this? This was post 9/11, I assume?
2002.
Yeah, okay. So it's post 9/11. You're going to go into the infantry. We are at war at that time, and your parents' reaction was what?
Like, why didn't you do something else? You know, I tested high enough to do it, but to do all kinds of weird things. But I really was excited about going in the infantry, you know.
What excited you about it?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like the main event, like being the lead guitarist in a rock band, you know. Not to take away from what anybody else does. When people think about the Army, they think about the infantry, and I didn't want to do anything other than that.
All right, so you sign up right out of high school, and you get in there, and you go to basic training. Was it what you were prepared for mentally?
Yeah, both my parents have military background,
okay.
So I mean, I came from a pretty systematic household. A lot of respect for authority, kind of like ground into you. So I mean, I didn't find basic training all that surprising. Challenging to be sure, but not surprising.
All right, so you finish basic, you get your first assignment. Do you go to the 101st at that point in time?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I initially signed up for.
Okay. And was there something about the 101st that attracted you to it?
Well, I mean, I had heard it was one of the only units I'd ever heard of. But I mean, I was a civilian and then an 18-year-old civilian, so I didn't know much about the Army, or especially very little about the unit. When
you get to your unit, what stood out to you the most? What was the first thing that jumped into your mind?
It was chaos. We were in between the September 11th happening and our first deployment to Iraq. It was kind of like the old Army was getting ready to deploy to war again for the first time in a long time. And, everybody was having to question a lot of assumptions they had made for the previous decade or so.
Why do you think they were questioning it?
Well, because like everything that they had known about deployment and war was purely theory, and then they came up against hard reality in a lot of cases. You know, in at that point in basic things like logistics and making sure everybody was good to deploy, making sure nobody was on profile. You know, the things that are kind of second nature now, but then were kind of like a huge change in the culture.
What was your first deployment to Iraq? What year was it?
It was in 2006. It was in 2003.
Okay, so during the initial invasion, you were with the 101st.
Yes.
Okay, what was that like?
I mean, it was pretty exciting. The Iraqis weren't able to mount any kind of significant resistance against us, and the entire army was used to a kind of conventional mindset. So we basically rampaged through Iraq. We're like Americans, so I mean, we're trying to help people out and stuff as we go. But like we were intellectually prepared for a much harder fight than we got. So, I mean, there was a little bit of chaos, but mostly it went fairly smooth, and it was pretty exciting. Everything was very brand new to everybody.
Moments ago when you said that it was the main event, like this is what you wanted, this is what you signed up for, when you went through that invasion, did you kind of get that adrenaline rush, and did it kind of meet that expectation that this is what you signed up for?
Yeah, absolutely, and that stuck with me for a few years until I realized that that's like what I did in the invasion is nothing. That's not what the infantry is about, So, I mean, it's kind of like the old adage: you can talk any fool to going into war one time,
Mm-hmm. Getting them to go back twice is the more difficult part. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was there anything? And again, for the people listening, I've said this repeatedly. I think all of us that are functional, rational human beings, when you go into combat, it's not something anybody wants. As much as you want to be tested and you want to see if you're up to the task, ultimately, it could lead to your mortality becoming a real thing. So I guess when you look back on that, do you think now that you took some bad chances or it was crazy to do what you did?
Yeah, but I mean, given the nature of our work, if you don't do it, somebody else has to, and often there's no room to say no. Like I'm not a commissioned officer, so I mean, often when I get told to do something crazy, or if something crazy, or if somebody decides something crazy has to happen, somebody's got to jump on that grenade, so to speak. So there's not a lot of room for doubt.
All right, so you're in part of the initial invasion. You are with the 101st. At this point in time, are you in the 502nd Infantry Regiment? You're in that same unit?
Yep, I've all four of my deployments. I was with the 1st of the 502nd Infantry.
Okay. And so what was morale like during the invasion for your particular unit?
I would say that initially it was really high because we thought we were going in for 6 months and then we'd be coming back. And then, we were getting to see and do a lot of things that we were hoping to do. And then we were all veterans, a lot of, we were all going to get to wear our CIB. We were all getting to go out on combat patrols and actually see what war was going to be like. I mean, it was fairly exciting. It was only towards about a third, maybe halfway through the deployment that, morale kind of started to get fairly low after we found out we were going to be there for a year. And the IEDs started to pop up every once and again.
Yeah, that probably changed the scope of a lot of things. And for those listening, that CIB, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, it's a big deal. If you're in the infantry and you don't have one, it's almost kind of like a scarlet letter for not having it. Am I right, John? Like in a sense that, a lot of guys around you have it. They've been in combat. That means they've been to the big leagues. They've gotten called up and they've answered the call and they've survived. And it's literally worn as a badge of honor. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even now that, the majority of the infantry that's been in for longer than a handful of years is wearing it. Back then, it was like platoon sergeants and above might have a CIB. It was very mysterious. It brought an instant credibility wherever you went.
And it's weird. The military has this kind of, for people who aren't military, but we know this, that there's this kind of prestige in what you have on your uniform, whatever reason, because it clearly details your career for others. If you're wearing a lot of ribbons and you're wearing, a lot of badges and things of that nature, people assume that you're well-traveled, that you've got all your stuff together, you know exactly what you're doing. And so certain badges like that, they carry a certain weight, as you just said.
Oh, absolutely. There's right now, if you're an infantryman, like a senior non-commissioned officer, you don't have a CIB or a combat patch, you're going to have a hard time establishing your credibility with like the junior grade non-commissioned officers. That's for certain.
All right, so let's kind of go back a little bit again towards the first deployment. The leadership there, what were they doing to kind of make sure that your morale stayed up? Because this is a big part of deployments. I think most people can take deployments between 6 and 9 months. Because I know in mine, like by the time I got to the 8-month mark, I knew it was time to go on leave. Like it was time to get out because I needed a recharge. And I just think from a standpoint of doing that same thing over and over again and the stress level, I think 8 or 9 months is when people really reach their max. So when you find that you're staying for a year, what was the leadership doing to try and maintain morale at a high level?
Well, at that time, like there weren't a lot of MWR opportunities and stuff like there are now.
Right.
And he would try to rotate squads or platoons back to the patrol base. We had honestly, for the first deployment, a lot of downtime because the mission wasn't incredibly clear. There just wasn't a lot of, and officers at the time perhaps weren't as experienced or well trained in like developing their own area of operations. Like there ended up being a lot of downtime.
Did that bother you?
No, I mean it was pretty all right. I mean, to be honest, like as bad as being bored can be sometimes, like just being miserable from patrolling for 12 or 16 hours a day is way worse. Especially when there's not like a well understood purpose.
Well, and that's the hard part, I think, and you hit it right on the head. I think most soldiers, all of us, can handle any task. As long as we know what the beginning looks like and the end state is, we can deal with everything in between. It's when we don't know where the end of this thing is that we get very, very flustered, and that boredom sometimes leads soldiers to make a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah, I mean, Bravo Company led the Army for 2 months for Article 15s while we were deployed. Just because soldiers thought they could get away with things because they thought it was like the Wild West on my first deployment. I ended up getting to go, even though it was like my first year in the Army, I got to go on mid-tour leave that first time, even though we had like a very limited number of slots because all my peers had Article 15s on that deployment for like getting tattoos or drinking or, whatever ridiculous stuff that they thought they could get away with because they thought it was nom.
Yeah, and I'm sure the older senior non-commissioned officers at that point in time who had some Gulf War experience, who had some older experience in that nature, probably were the ones who were allowing stuff like that to go on because it was just a different time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The thing is, like, the popular perception of soldiers of what war was like, and then what the Army had decided as a matter of policy war was like, hadn't exactly like met up in the middle yet.
Yeah, and trust me, I don't know what your last deployment was in Iraq, but by the time you left your second deployment, they still hadn't met. When I went back in 2011, trust me, there was a huge gap between the two, and it was growing wider every single day. So, okay, let's kind of bring this back. You end your first deployment, and when you guys come back and you get everybody back to the States, first of all, did you lose any guys on the first deployment?
Yes, we lost one person who was with our brigade sergeant major. He got basically ambushed on a highway by himself with his PSD element, which is just him and this guy, and they drug him out of the car and killed him.
Who was the PSD? I'm sorry, the PSD, just so people listening, is a personal security detail. Who was it for?
The brigade sergeant major, and it consists of one person.
Really? That's like odd because PSDs in deployments now, especially for generals, are what, 8-10 people deep?
Oh, just to roll out on a convoy, they have to be at least 9.
Right.
And it's like 3 or 4 vehicles. But they were driving like un-up-armored like Tahoes and stuff back then.
Yeah.
Like there were officers who would do PT outside the gate in PTs with no protective equipment on.
That is crazy because anybody who was there after, for what is known as OIF 1 was the initial invasion, Operation Iraqi Freedom 1. That's the initial invasion through 2004. And from the middle of 2004 to 05 was OIF 2. And then 05 to 06 was OIF 3. And that's when I got there for OIF 3 for the first time. And you didn't think of walking anywhere near outside the wire by the time you got to late in OIF 2. because it was just it was at that point you were signing your own death warrant.
Yeah, absolutely. It was incredibly dangerous. Just at the very end of the invasion tour that things started to get dangerous. It took a while for the Army to realize what this war was going to be like.
Yeah, because I don't think anybody ever knew. When we started it, we didn't have a clear finish in mind, and that's kind of what, in the grand scheme of things, in the big picture, kept us there so long. Okay, so you get back. What was it like when you first got back? Was there a sense of relief? Was there a sense of pride? What were you feeling?
Well, I mean, it was an immense sense of pride, but I mean, also like some confusion. You know, the deployment kind of defied my expectations of what combat was going to be like. It was a lot more laid back, a little bit more chaotic, and you know, I didn't feel like we had the kind of purpose that I expected from combat missions. So I mean, I was pretty aware of the fact that I didn't know what combat was. I didn't believe for a second that I had really seen it at that point.
What? Okay, so dive into this a little bit deeper. What was your expectation of combat, and give me an example of how it didn't meet it?
Well, I mean, combat, to me, implies a plan and intent on both sides and there's some friction. Generally in the form of small arms contact, IEDs, and like that negotiation with the enemy, like embeds within you, like certain limitations in your behavior, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and it also like gives you like a laser kind of focus on what you're doing day to day, especially if you're able to put together like what the enemy's trying to do, and you're able to anticipate the friction that you're going to come to.
Well, and I think part of that notion also, and one of the biggest problems that we've had in warfare post 9/11 is your enemy prior to that was wearing a different uniform. They were easily spottable. You knew who they were. You knew what they looked like. That wasn't the case in Iraq and Afghanistan. The enemy didn't come wearing a uniform that said, hey, I'm the bad guy. They all looked like civilians. They all looked the same. It was hard to tell a lot of them apart. Was that part of the issue?
I think a lot of it was that the officer corps was kind of out of practice. I mean, like, what we're talking about doing isn't necessarily rocket science, but if you take a caveman and bring him to your living room and ask him to turn your DVD player on, like, he's going to have a problem. No matter how easy the task is, if you can't conceive of it, you can't achieve it. So, like, the kind of planning that we have to do in Iraq and Afghanistan now, like, was kind of learned as if the Army had never gone to war before. Like, we had a doctrine, but we didn't have an officer, a junior officer corps. I don't know what the senior officer corps was like, that had internalized why these things that they were supposed to be doing were important.
No, and that's fair. You know, again, as an officer, I agree that especially the junior officer corps sometimes doesn't get developed enough by the senior officer corps. I mean, I could speak to that early in my career. There's not a lot of mentoring going on, and as the chaos of war continues, it's hard to train people on the job at that point in time because you're so mission focused. You're so mission oriented on getting done what's in front of you. You just kind of want people to execute what your vision is or what you understand the mission to be, and there's not a lot of teaching going on. Is that what you're indicating?
Yeah, and you know, that cost us pretty dearly from the second and third deployments. But I mean, we developed skills. Well, I personally developed skills, and I know a lot of lieutenants that have also done so, like right around the third deployment, where we were capable of more individual action and staying within the commander's scope and actually like pursuing goals with an actual tactical purpose instead of just doing what we were being told to do until we were told to stop.
All right, so you're back from your first deployment. How much downtime was there between the first and the second?
18 months.
Okay, so you did have a full 18 months. Now, was that time used actually going through what the Army determines reset, where you kind of just, you get everybody back together, you get a little downtime, you get a little leave, and then you start training up and getting everybody ready to go back to war? Did you have that kind of full deal?
Yeah, absolutely. We went to JRTC, we did NTC. In that time, they stood up a new brigade at my division, so like there was a little bit of a logistical problem there. But I mean, for the most part, for the second deployment, we were pretty ready logistically, and and training, we brought a lot of assumptions from our first deployment to our second deployment, which ended up hurting us in our training and things of that nature. Like train as you fight kind of bit us. But I mean, there was no way that we could have foreseen that.
Was morale better when you left for the second deployment or the first?
I'm going to say morale was much better on the second one. On the first one, like, a lot of people who were there, like, had no idea that they were actually going to deploy during their military service. So, to be honest, like, the first deployment kind of came as a shock to a lot of, like, older specialists and sergeants. But the second deployment, everybody knew what they were in for, and because we had such a positive time during the first deployment, I mean, we really we went into it pretty overconfident, which is pretty good for morale.
Okay, so you head out for the second deployment. Did you, like you talked about earlier, with knowing a mission and understanding the beginning and the end? Did you have that going in?
Not really. The battalion commander, I believe, had a vision, and the company commander, I believe, like, was working kind of to support that vision. But I think that because of the amount of friction we hit in our second deployment and the amount of combat we saw, that at a certain point, like, the plan became more grandiose than like what we were able to actually accomplish. And because those two things didn't line up, it was just mass confusion. Was the leadership the same on both deployments? No. New company command. We went through two company commanders. So we were on our second company commander when we left for the second deployment, and the battalion had swapped over. Okay, but was the battalion? It was all new chain of command. Was the battalion commander the same? No. Okay, so every commander from the platoon to the division was different. Okay, so the point in illustrating that to people listening is that, you know, the tenor of each leadership chain of command is totally different. It's hard to really find ones that are exactly the same. As you would expect with different people, they're going to expect different things, and so that kind of just changes the tenor of the way people may act on a given deployment or in any given situation within the military. That's part of, you know, what makes leadership so essential going forward. All right, so you get to the second deployment. Conditions worse or better than your first deployment as far as living and everything else? Oh, absolutely. It was way worse. Okay, why? Both logistically and environmentally. Well, the road that we lived on, we lived on several checkpoints that were stretched out over a couple kilometers of road that had IEDs on it every single day that had already killed a couple dozen soldiers, and kind of frustrated the Army's best attempt to clear it. And then we took over for a National Guard unit that had taken a considerable number of casualties and already didn't have the manpower to do the mission that they were assigned. So, like, as far as maintenance of a living space and things of that nature, they just weren't able to keep up. It was pretty atrocious. Okay, so you get there when for your second deployment? Do you remember the month and the year? September 2006 for the second deployment. Okay. 2005. I apologize. Okay, so September 2005. Yeah. Okay. You get there in September 2005. Conditions are worse. Did that automatically set things off in a bad, get off to a bad start, make things get off to a bad start? I would say there was a little bit of, what we were being told about the AO by the outgoing unit was that it was much more dangerous than we were originally seeing for maybe the first 30 days. So there was a bit of anticipation, because we were constantly on the lookout for this amount of violence that just hadn't manifested yet. I would say that the logistics and stuff, that wasn't really as big a deal. I mean, we're the infantry, like, dealing with suffering is kind of, like, easily half the job. Right, obviously. Welcome to the suck, as they say. But, okay, so first platoon, you were in Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment in 101st Airborne Division. What was 1st Platoon's mission? Initially, 1st Platoon's mission was to seize basically a static position on one side of the Jefferson Cycle Bridge, which was basically like an American-style, like road bridge and then the road and interact with the personnel around us to kind of honestly just try to pacify the area. The previous unit hadn't been able to do much with local national engagement or anything of that nature. So we thought originally that was pretty much going to be our mission.
And just to give people an understanding, the area that you guys are in, Yusufiyah, Mahmoudiya, is directly south of Baghdad, probably about 30 miles or so, 30, 45 miles. It's not a fairly long drive from where, the big military post was right there in Baghdad. But the lay of the land out there, all farmland, very open, very rural. Am I correct in stating all this from what I remember?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're just dirt cities every once and again, but for the most part, it's just a rural farm field. Okay.
And I just want to set that up so people understand that, there's not a lot of paved roads. There's not a lot of, shops or businesses like they're in downtown Baghdad, where there's a city, it's a metropolis and all those things. I just think it's important to understand as we go forward in the story that, we paint a little bit of a visual. All right, so you guys are out there and we have some bad dudes setting up IEDs on the roads, which you guys are patrolling, correct?
Yep, every day.
All right, and so your goal basically was to either find the IEDs and disarm them or find the bad guys and bring them to justice.
Well, I mean, ostensibly, but primarily it was to clear the road to allow through traffic.
Right.
But there were IEDs on it every single day.
So you guys would patrol the area, and essentially patrols, correct me if I'm wrong, these are just, 3-4 vehicles filled with soldiers, sometimes walking on foot as well, just walking around the area, looking for bad guys, looking for things out of the ordinary, trying to find the people who are doing this.
We normally had to do patrols with 3 to 4 men, period.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
And then vehicle-wise, we might have one truck that might be able to take the route, which was obviously insanely dangerous.
Yeah, because by the time I had got there, nobody left without 3 vehicles. By the time I had gotten there in 2005, at least when we were in Baghdad, nobody rolled outside the wire without a minimum of 3 vehicles because of safety concerns and just having the combat firepower if something went wrong to be able to sustain the fight.
Right.
So you guys are there, 4 men, 1 vehicle, walking around. As you do these patrols, what's running through your head most days?
For me, I guess I was just trying to figure out how to. Well, obviously, I was pretty angry about having to do them, but mostly I was trying to figure out, tactically, what were they doing that allowed them to place IEDs on this road every day? Was there any way to interfere with it? And then how do I, if I have to take a reactionary position, how do I do this how do I check a mailbox that may have a bomb in it without getting blown up? You know what I mean?
What's the fear like in that?
Grinding. It's just, there's a number of things that are all working together that are kind of destroying your sense of purpose. But the fear, not necessarily of the IEDs. It wasn't until we saw 5 or 6 people die that it started to have a significant effect on operations in the platoon.
Do you remember who the first person was who was killed?
Nelson and Kasika were the first 2 people to die.
Okay.
And they were both non-commissioned officers at a checkpoint. They were trying to do the hearts and minds thing. And a guy with a gun and a guy walked in with a pistol in the back of his belt and then shot them both in the head at close range before he was taken out by the guy on security.
And so basically when you say the hearts and minds thing, just so people understand, part of our ancillary mission when we were there was to win over the Iraqi civilians, to win over the people and let them know that what we were doing there was for their benefit, to help them, to help rebuild Iraq, build a democracy, all those things that you saw on the news that that the politicians talked about. Yeah, we actually heard the same things, and they wanted us to do and accomplish the same things. But in certain cases, it was met with a decent amount of resistance, obviously, as the story you just told. And just, again, so we're clear, so you guys were out there shaking hands and meeting people, and somebody comes up and just pops 2 of your soldiers.
Right.
And what was
go
ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, what was the kind of feeling right after that?
Well, the reaction by the leadership was a little hysterical. I'm talking about the platoon level leadership. throughout the first deployment, we only had one guy die, and nobody from the company was around. So now that we actually had to do Kazakh for the first time as an organization, it was pretty clear to see that. I mean, it was ultimately like an academic body of knowledge for most of the people involved. I mean, for us, I mean, it was a sense of like, okay, this is real now. Like, you know, I've gotten through all of this deployment and up to this point without seeing like what it's really like, and now we're here. Now we're in combat. You know.
Mm-hmm. So after your two soldiers get killed, how did morale change?
I think that it became more insular. Like, we were really far separated from the battalion and even the company. I mean, the platoons became like little tiny families. So, I mean, it was in a bad way, but I mean, the bonds got tighter, but in our case, in a toxic way.
How so? Why did they turn toxic?
Well, I mean, like, we all work for the Army, the big A Army. The Army has rules, the Army has systems, like the Army has people who are in charge and people who are not in charge, and there's a way that they're supposed to interact. But if everybody's your best friend or your buddy or the one person that you can rely on, like that, it tends to erode very quickly military discipline.
Okay, and just kind of explain, give me like an example so people can understand.
Well, I mean, ultimately, like, we wouldn't get food for a while, so there was one squad that was always fed because they had a guy who knew the cook, you know, like, so he would be able to secure food for his squad, but everybody else would starve. Like, it's stuff like that. This little like, I guess you would call it like writ large, like a good old boy system, but it stops being a military unit. It starts being like small clusters of really good friends that are all working together, and they're not all necessarily, the Army isn't their first priority.
Did it almost become like Lord of the Flies, if you will? I don't know if you've ever read that book.
Yeah, absolutely.
With Piggy on the island and whoever has the conch is in charge, and did it almost become kind of like that clique?
To a degree. I mean, because we're Americans and we have we've been socialized in a civilized environment, like there's a limit to how ridiculous it can get in public. But I mean, in private, the problem is, like, I was a brand new promoted E5, and I really believed in the Army a lot more than I believed in myself. So I didn't really have the same experience everybody else did. Like, I didn't, you know, I was a sergeant, and I was super overconfident in my rank. So, you know, I didn't have to be best friends with everybody the way other people did.
Sure.
But it definitely worked against them, for sure.
Okay, so those two soldiers are killed. You are a squad leader at this point in time, correct? When you're as an E5?
No, just a team leader.
You're a team leader? Okay, you're a team leader at this point in time. And take me leading up to the events, you know, of what happened in Mahmudiya as far as what happened next that continually started to degrade morale after those two guys died.
Well, I mean, continuously more people die. Our lieutenant was basically put on a railroad track of a mission that said, you know, you will go here and you will do this. It was insanely dangerous. Everybody knew the area, and he tried to protest it and lost his protest, so he had to go do it. Then he got killed along with two other people.
Just pause there for 1 second. When he made his protest, did he let you guys know that he protested, or was he the kind of leader who just kept his mouth shut?
He was the kind of leader that he was a West Pointer and like a very, very old school. And I mean that, like, he was very well socialized in West Point. Like, he was lieutenant, like, to the bone.
Mm-hmm. And with that, basically, again, for those who don't understand, you know, West Point is the military academy that grooms officers, but these are the best of the best guys, supposedly. Most of them are guys who, you know, are your typical poster boy for the military. That's the way they grow up. There are certain factions of the military, like I was ROTC. I questioned a lot more things throughout my military career. If it didn't make sense to me, I put my hand up and said, yo, this is not working. This doesn't make any sense. And sometimes it was met with a lot of resistance, other times not, depending on who the leadership is. But when you get kind of those guys, as you said, if you ask them to go stand in the middle of a train track, they'll salute and say, Roger, sir, I'm moving out, and that's it. So he was that type of guy, and it ultimately led to his demise.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said way earlier in the interview, it's just sometimes there's just not an opportunity to get out of the way of the speeding train. It was unfortunate, the company commander, that tore him apart because basically we had to cross a canal, and the lieutenant was like, hey, we shouldn't cross this canal because I guarantee you there's an IED on the other side. And the captain said, well, you get your fat body over that canal and you go over there like I said. And then he got cut in half. I mean, the company commander was just torn apart.
Well, I mean, how could you not be? At that point in time, you've basically, signed somebody else's death warrant. Like, you have not directly killed somebody, but that would weigh on anybody. I mean, it's your decision that led to somebody else's death, and that's something that, as leaders, is always tough to swallow. I mean, when you lose one of your men or one of your soldiers, that is what will keep you up at night. Did you do enough? Were your decisions part of the reason why they're not there, why they're not around anymore? And I certainly can understand that. How did other people in the platoon react?
Well, I mean, it just became even tighter, even more insular.
Were people mad at the company commander?
I mean, it was really difficult to be mad at. I mean, we were angry at his incompetence, but we weren't necessarily angry at him, the person.
Okay.
Because we knew for a fact that he didn't have any more say in this than we did. This was a very, battalion-centric, tactical operations. He was functionally what would now be a squad leader. So, he had that level of influence at the time.
All right, so the platoon leader gets killed. A new guy comes in. Did it make it better, make it worse?
At the time, I think it makes it a little worse. I mean, he was an excellent lieutenant. He was an ROTC guy, a pretty smart and well-respected guy. But, I mean, he didn't know the people he was working with. So at this point, the criminality and things that were going on in the platoon started to become toxic to people's behavior. And he couldn't see enough fast enough to prevent it.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so there's a kid coming up for promotion. His name is Cortez. He participated later in the deployment. He would participate in a rape and a murder. But right now, he's a specialist pending promotion to E5. There's no way that either the platoon sergeant or the PL would have allowed that to happen in the previous chain of command.
Okay, why?
But now that we have a new guy, the squad leader is vouching for this soldier, and so he gets the promotion, and now he's a sergeant. And in an environment where you're patrolling with 4 men, that means he's functionally got zero oversight.
Right. And so he was the wrong guy for that job, essentially.
Absolutely. There are certain things that you trust people to do at any job that it increases efficiency. And the problem was he invested too much trust into people who didn't deserve it, but he had no way of knowing that at the time.
Okay, give me some more of the events that are leading up to what happened in Mahmudiyah. What's next? You have the new lieutenant. I think I remember reading that you lost 2 platoon sergeants, correct?
Well, the first platoon sergeant, after Lieutenant Britt died, sort of fell apart on us. He was a Ranger Tab D6 who just went and found another job. He just couldn't hack it. And then we got Sergeant Gallagher, a sergeant first class who was very old school and very, very direct, very strict. And the platoon just whined until they got rid of him. And
Really?
then we got a third platoon sergeant.
Why did they whine so much? I mean, that doesn't seem consistent with
because he wanted them to do their job, and at this point, a lot of the guys in the platoons just decided the job was impossible, and that Sergeant Gallagher just didn't understand.
Was there a sense from a lot of soldiers that basically, when missions came down to go patrol this, that, and was there any objecting, going, look, I'm not going there. I'm not walking into my death willfully?
No, I mean, honestly, they would just cheat most of the time.
How so?
I mean, you're going to find that if wherever people take away other people's agency, they're going to find a way to slip it back into the equation when you're not looking. So they'll park in some ruins and just call up fake frontline traces, or they'll, pretend they're doing patrols that they're not, there's all kind of like, it's not unique to this unit, believe me. Like it had, like, whenever somebody's being overbearing in command and not checking up enough, there will be corruption in a way.
Did you ever do anything like that?
No.
Did any of your soldiers that you were in charge of on your team do it?
Yeah. Yeah, that happened a couple times. I had 2 soldiers that were captured and tortured to death on a TCP because they weren't wearing their equipment. They weren't, minding their sector. They functionally, like, were on a little vacation in the middle of the Triangle of Death without any kit on, like, convinced that nothing was going to happen.
Was that PFC Tuckle and Menka? How do you say his last name?
Christopher Menchaca.
Menchaca? It was those 2?
Yeah.
Okay. But that was after everything that had already happened, correct? Everything that happened in Mahmudiya?
Oh, right. Yeah, that was basically immediately after the rape and murder was reported.
So the morale in the unit is obviously low. You have obviously people fearing for their lives every day. The leadership has it fair to say, abandoned you guys at this point in time from the company and above?
They're just completely out of their depth. The battalion is like an irate stepdad yelling at a deaf kid who can't understand or even conceive of what he's talking about, and the company commander's so out of his depth that he might as well not even be there.
Did they ever come and visit you guys? Because, when I was deployed, I had my soldiers spread to different parts of Iraq. I made it a point to always go visit them, to let them know that, hey, I'm still here. I'm still looking out for you. I'm still concerned about you. Did they ever come by?
It happened from time to time, but they were never events to, like, put on your calendar. Primarily, they would get there. They would yell at us about some standards that, honestly were important. But at the time I was like a young E5. I didn't understand like I should have. But ultimately, like, even today, like, their priorities should have been probably somewhat different. They weren't there to help us out, or by that I mean provide us the necessary things that we needed to become more safe, or any additional mission clarity. They were just there to basically make spot corrections and get angry with us.
And I'm sure that didn't do anything to help morale, obviously.
Well, like, we see the guy, like, once in a blue moon. Like, he can come in here and yell at me for not having my ACU top on filling sandbags, like, if that's what he wants to do, but he's going to turn his back, and it'll be like he never existed.
Right.
If you make yourself completely unpalatable as a leader, like, you better be there every second of the day.
Yeah, it's the only way you're going to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, because, as you said,
right,
the minute
you have no influence,
right? The minute
people aren't going to do what you want just because they like you or because they think it's important. They're only going to do it if you physically make them do it.
So when the rape and killings happened in Mahmudiya, you weren't part of it, but I guess kind of give people a sense. When it happened, did anybody have a sense that it happened, or was it just another day?
Well, really, it was just another day, if you could call any day in Yusufiyah another day. But I was just pulling guard. It was like 2 a.m, and I heard some gunshots, and then the sun came up. I was still on guard, and I heard over basically our little short range radios that, hey, like, somebody attacked a local national house, and it looks like they killed them. And we, at the time, it was blamed by the perpetrators. It was blamed on the AQI. And so I remember thinking to myself, like, man, those people are animals. Like, that is disgusting. Like, it was incomprehensible to me how one human being could do that to another for no purpose.
Just to set a little background, the Iraqis were not immune from killing their own. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, as you said, had no problem doing it and doing it in the worst way. So to hear that something like that happened and it be blamed on Iraqis is not a far-fetched thing for anybody to hear. Initially, it probably wouldn't raise any eyebrows, just simply because it was a fairly common thing, unfortunate, but still a fairly common thing as far as the environment of daily life there at that time, correct?
Well, absolutely. We were fishing bodies out of the Tigris River every day from like their crazy checkpoints where Sunnis and Shiites would shoot each other in the face for going into each other's turf. It was, or excuse me, the Euphrates. It was, I mean, they were killing each other by like, at a scale like that's not really imaginable to Americans, I guess, that haven't seen anything like it.
So give us the kind of timeline. When do you guys start to hear about what had happened?
I mean, ultimately, like I was just going on about my merry way. It was one of the soldiers in the platoon, Justin Watt, who basically started putting it together almost immediately after, but then managed to get confirmation. I think it was, to be honest, he was in the squad at one point with the soldiers who had conducted the action. So, right. I mean, he had close relationships with a lot of them, and they trusted him. And so, like, individually, he just approached them over time and eventually got enough of the story to piece it together. And then after he was able to confirm it, he came to me and basically laid it out.
What was that conversation like?
We were getting ready to, like, just do a relief in place, and he was like, "Hey, Diem, I got something to tell you, but I can't tell you right now. It's super important." I was like, whatever, just tell me right now. And he's like, "You can't tell anyone, And I was like, "Yeah, I promise I won't tell anyone." He basically laid out to me that, these soldiers got drunk at a TCP, they raped and murdered an Iraqi family, and then another non-commissioned officer from the platoon covered it up. And he had enough, like, hard facts that, kind of defy creativity that I knew almost immediately upon hearing it that it was right. Justin and Hardy reported it to a combat stress technician that happened to be visiting us, but they were, I guess, like, talking to their superiors, and it really didn't go anywhere. But when I heard it, I basically immediately ran it up the chain. I mean, after about 4 hours of thought, I just couldn't hold on to it,
When you hear the initial, story from Justin Watt, who was a PFC at the time, and you're a sergeant, what is your initial reaction?
At first, it's bewilderment. It's just there's a lot of facts surrounding this case. So, like, comparing it, like, is this a believable thing that could have happened?
I was going to say, was there ever a moment of doubt?
No. The thing is, me and Justin had a pretty close relationship in the platoon, and it was one based on, like, character-based merit. So I knew for a fact that if he felt it was important enough to tell me that he absolutely believed it.
So when Justin tells you, did you know at that time that he had already talked to a psychological health person or who he had revealed it to?
No.
Okay, so you didn't know anything else. So you thought you were under the assumption you were the first person being told about the rape of a 14-year-old girl and the murder of a family.
Right.
Okay, and so with this information, when you say you run it up the chain, who do you go to next?
Immediately I went up to guard, and I was on guard for 4 hours, where I just sat and stewed on it and, like, made sure that I had all my ducks in the row. Because I knew for a fact that whoever I was going to have to sell this story to whoever I talked to next, because it's just because of the stakes involved. Like, if they discount it, it could go very badly for Justin. Like, Justin was afraid that he was going to get murdered if they found out he talked, or if all of them were together for long enough, they would find out that Justin knew the story and decide to kill him. And that was honestly, like, a very realistic look at the situation. So I had to make sure that I only got one strike at the anvil for this, so I had to make sure it was good. So, and then I went to the platoon sergeant and PL and laid it out for them.
Okay, and when you did that, what was their reaction?
The lieutenant didn't believe me. He just didn't have, he's a good man in the sense that, like, Jesus was a good person. Like, he was an innocent man. He just, like, he doesn't have thoughts like that. You know what I mean? Like, he's never wanted to harm anybody, like, senselessly ever in his life. The platoon sergeant, like, did believe it, with some reservation.
Okay, so when they don't believe it, do you feel any despair? Or are you like, now what do I do?
No, because I made it pretty plain to them. I made it pretty plain to them that, like, either they were going to talk to the battalion or I was. Like, because I just couldn't take no for an answer. Like, if they allowed it to die at this level, like, I couldn't allow that outcome. So I had to push it as high as it could go. Like, to the point where it, like, gained a momentum of its own and would begin to move. I really believed that, yes, the interpersonal relationships in the Army, like, can be toxic, and if they can interfere with this investigation, they will. But there comes a point in the Army where Big A Army gets hold of it, and there's nobody can interfere anymore.
Right.
Or at least that's what I believed.
No, I think there's a certain amount of truth to that, and obviously we know now, in the unfortunate nature of all the sexual assaults and things that have gone on, that when it's found out at a certain level, there's no hiding. I mean, everybody is the lights are shining, cockroaches go running on a white rug, and everybody is brought in front of this whole thing, and rightfully so. But to your credit, that's where you were with this whole thing as far as shining a light on this. Were they your platoon leader, platoon sergeant? Were they resistant to the idea that you were going to go above their head?
No, I mean, I've got kind of a reputation for not being afraid of that kind of thing. Not necessarily going above people's heads, but like when it's time to take like a decisive action like that, like I don't really consider consequences. Like they knew that if I thought it was important enough to say that basically I was telling them like, hey, I'm giving you the opportunity to do this before I do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I'm
like,
tracking.
Fundamentally, they felt like what I was doing was a courtesy.
Okay. And so did you tell somebody next or they did?
They did.
Okay. And so what happens? I mean, I know you had said that Justin Watt, the PFC, who was the initial whistleblower on this thing, was he in danger? Did you feel like he was in danger?
Yes. I absolutely thought he was in danger. The battalion commander, company commander, and platoon leader, platoon sergeant didn't share my conviction, but I mean, they were still, I guess, they didn't believe that kind of thing could happen in the Army. So Justin was actually at a checkpoint at this time while we're talking with the people who actually committed the rape and murder, with a few of them. The battalion commander, within 24 hours, the company commander, the battalion commander, and the battalion sergeant major all come to our little part of the AO, which is just like a little platoon patrol base.
24 hours after you had told the lieutenant and the platoon sergeant, they come by.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they come in. And the battalion commander, like, hears it and just doesn't buy it, right? He discounts it to the lieutenant's face. And then they leave with their PSD, and they make sure to stop at every checkpoint where one of these guys are located to let them know that somebody is basically saying that they raped and murdered a family, even to the point where when they arrived at the checkpoint that Justin was at, they pulled him aside, yelled at him for accusing, in front of one of the non-commissioned officers who was there, they yelled at him for allegedly falsely accusing this non-commissioned officer of rape and murder. And then they were going to leave him there.
So the guy does the honorable thing, does the right thing, and tells people that a rape and a murder have been committed, and wants to do the right thing, and his chain of command, the highest level of his chain of command, the battalion commander, basically gets irritated at him for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so...
I mean, he was going to leave him there at the checkpoint after basically outing him in front of the Sergeant Garibi, so...
Right, so essentially, the guys who had committed these acts watched the battalion commander, let them know that he knows what went on, even though he doesn't believe Justin Watt. Now, the guys who did this know that Justin Watt was the whistleblower.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so did he leave him in there?
No, like, I heard him getting ready to check out at Justin's PCP, so I asked his PSD, do you have Justin Watt with you? And they were like, no. And I was like, well, you must pick him up. Like, he has to go with you. Which kind of outed me at the same time, because I was at a TCP with two of the guys who did it as well. But I was, whatever, you know? Like, it had to happen.
What do you mean, whatever? Like, that's a tough spot for you to be in. Were you ever concerned? I mean, were you ever like, you know, for a second, did you ever pause and go, if I say something now, I could be a dead man?
Well, I mean, it was a thought, but I didn't have time to really measure the risk. You know what I mean?
Right.
He was leaving right then, so I mean, it was a do or die moment. You know.
You tell somebody from the PSD, what do they do? Do you ever speak to the colonel?
No, I got a hold of the lieutenant in charge of the PSD, and I guess he got out of the truck and talked to the lieutenant colonel, who made the call to drop off one of his PSD soldiers so that he could pick up Justin and stuff.
Okay, so Justin ends up getting out of there.
Yeah.
All right, and was there a sense of relief from you at that point?
No, because, I mean, like, Justin's gone. You know, like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be bad with Justin. And then, obviously, I'm stuck with a bunch of rapists and murderers at a checkpoint. So, I mean, relief, I guess, wasn't really in the cards.
Well, I mean, I just meant relief for him, that he was out of harm's way. But I guess, as you're telling it, even though he was out of harm's way for that moment, you just felt like more bad things were going to happen to him?
Well, I mean, somebody bet badly on the battalion commander. If the battalion commander chose to, and which is exactly what he did, basically discount Justin's accusations, it would put him in a position where he would be held legally responsible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, a lot of bad things can still happen to Justin at this stage.
Well, and just for, again, clarification, you know, the chain of command serves a purpose, and you may have read about this in other incidents and things that have happened, but when bad stuff happens, the chain of command, all of it gets in trouble. I mean, and it goes down, as you said. So if a PFC does something bad like that, not only does it go to the platoon leader, but it goes to the company commander and the battalion commander. Even though they may not have even physically been in the same spot and had no control over it happening, they're still held responsible. And to that end, I guess the colonel, and I think his name is Thomas Kunk, right? Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
Yeah. So he was. Did you get a sense that he was only kind of cover his own ass at that point?
Well, I mean, I think that he was just an alpha personality who didn't believe the story because the people are afraid to believe things that they either. I mean, people believe things that they either want to be true really badly or things that they fear to be true. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think at the end of the day, like the consequences of this being true were such that he had to reject it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Like, I think that he believed it. I think that he wanted to. I think that he believed that the best way to prove it to a degree was to put pressure on the guy who said it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So kind of take me through the events of what's happening next. I mean, you're at a total breakdown in leadership, a total breakdown in structure of a platoon that's sustained terrible losses, multiple losses. You're at a small little, you know, I guess for lack of a better term, combat outpost. Not a lot of amenities, not a lot of creature comforts. You don't have internet. You don't have contact with families. What are you thinking at this point in time?
Well, I mean, it's just anticipation. I know something big's about to happen either way. Just a few days before this, we had 2 soldiers captured and tortured to death, and then this happened. So something significant is about to happen to this platoon. So I guess it's just like holding your breath and waiting for it to kind of fall down around you.
And the soldiers we mentioned earlier, PFC's Tucker and Menchaca, they were actually, you know, captured and killed by the enemy. And that was in direct retaliation for the rape and murder of that family.
No, there's no way that the people who did that could have known that American soldiers did it.
Okay, they couldn't have.
That's what they claimed later on.
Right.
But that's what they claimed later on. But they to add justification to their actions. But no, it wasn't direct.
Okay, so
there's no direct link between those events.
And when those, and there was a third one who was also killed. As I read it, Specialist David Babineau was also killed during that attack. But Tucker and Menchaca were captured and then killed. So after, let me kind of just chronologically help me out here. So the whistle is blown, then these guys get captured and killed. Correct?
No, these guys get captured and killed, then the whistle is blown.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so you had. I can't even in my head, you know, put all the stress together. Like it's just impossible to keep up with at this point in time. Is anybody there within a chain of command trying to do anything to kind of just let some steam out of this thing? Because it feels like it's a pressure cooker right now.
No. I mean, nobody had any influence. This was completely, we all knew that the sort of Damocles was over our head, and everybody was just sort of like, okay, here it comes, you know? Like, nobody was in control, and nobody had any influence. Like, a lot of people were, like, going through their network of contacts and influence to, like, get promised other assignments or things of that nature after the platoon was dismantled, but nobody had any functional control over what was about to happen.
Well, and you mentioned the platoon being dismantled because I think standard practice now in the military, if something like this had happened, they would have done that. They would have automatically replaced everybody, gotten them out of there to do an investigation and things of that nature. But obviously, at that time, given the operational tempo that was going on, you couldn't just yank the platoon away from there, right?
Well, that's what they ended up doing.
How long did that take?
Maybe a couple weeks.
Okay.
Maybe a week and a half. It was immediately after the memorial service for Tucker, Babs, and Chaka.
Okay, so at that memorial service, did the people who committed these crimes, did they go to that?
Yes. I mean, they were currently under questioning by CID. It was actually that day that one of them broke and gave up the story and was able to confirm that what Justin said was true.
Okay, so one of them came forward, and did.
Well, he broke under intense CID questioning.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so it was a questioning. Okay, so you get a confession out of one of these guys, and you know, again, we don't need to get all the gory details. I don't think that serves any purpose at this point in time. People can find them if they really want them, but you get a confession. Does everything start to come out and roll downhill quickly? How does this all end up playing out after?
Well, I mean, in a way, the battalion commander was able to, like, isolate his battalion from the effects. He just pulled the people out that were involved, and they were obviously incarcerated. Justin was moved from the platoon immediately and pushed to PSYOP, and then we were put on guard for 18 hours a day for a couple months, the rest of the platoon, until the battalion was ripped in place.
By ripped, you mean replaced in place? That's just a term for it, so people understand.
Yeah, my bad.
Was that tough to deal with every day, waiting for this whole thing? I mean, essentially being, for lack of a better term, sentenced just to pull duty and do nothing while this whole thing is unfolding.
I mean, that was a kind of a crazy roller coaster. I mean, the guys were kind of freaking out about it originally because we were getting moved to Mamadiyah under the flagpole and stuff. And obviously the battalion commander wasn't our biggest fan, so we knew that this was about to get terrible. But I told the guys, like, I remember there was a point I was like, listen, guys, you're going to live. And, like, dudes cried. You know, like, I was like, listen, like, whatever, we're not leaving the fob, so you guys know for a fact that you're going to live. And guys, like, broke down crying.
Because they were so happy they were going to live?
Yeah. I mean, we had lost almost half the platoon, so...
How big was the platoon when you got there?
It was about 27 people total.
Okay. And so half that's gone, and you tell them they're going to live, and they break down crying. And I guess, when does, I'm trying to figure out when this sense of relief comes in that all this stuff is over. Does it ever come?
No.
Why?
I mean, like, we were kind of put in a position where our punishment was every day.
Right.
I guess when we redeploy, I guess that's when most of us feel like it's over. But, I mean, Justin got beat up a couple times after we redeployed. Like, I mean, it wasn't over, you know?
Why did he get beat up?
Because soldiers felt like he was a rat, you know? They didn't agree with his decision to come forward.
It's very hard to process. Even for somebody who's been in combat and seen the worst it has to offer, very hard to process that a group of people who committed a rape and a murder would be defended because somebody told the truth.
I mean, even today, we go around and we talk about ethics, and this comes up, and there's always going to be a soldier. There's going to be a group of soldiers who don't think that you should come forward. Those people exist. They're in your formation right now. at all ranks.
I guess that's fair.
We've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously you have, and that unfortunately, and you know, we see that today in other forms, whether it be domestic violence or sexual assault or whatever it is. There's always somebody out there who's not wanting to believe that bad stuff happens and wants to take the side of the fact that, well, you know, you just shouldn't tell people the bad things that have gone on, and hopefully everybody will turn a blind eye and it'll go away. But obviously, that's never the case. How much of this has stayed with you?
I mean, I've worked through it pretty well. I feel like most of the guys who are in the platoon are either alcoholics or in jail or homeless or any number of other things. Like, I think there's like 3 or 4 of us that are like functioning members of society, and I count myself among that number. So, I mean, I was able to work through it emotionally pretty well.
You know, we talked to a lot of people on this podcast about the bonds that exist between soldiers and how it extends well past when you leave a deployment. Like, there are guys who I deployed with, they picked up the phone and called me today. I would answer, and I would talk with them like we had never stopped serving together. Is it hard that you don't have a lot of that with those guys?
No, absolutely not.
Why?
I mean, well, to be honest, Justin is my roommate right now. So,
Okay.
like, the part of the platoon that I wanted to keep with me is still with me. But other than that, like, I mean, it was the worst year of my life by a lot. I was just too ignorant and too weak to have any influence on the outcome. So it was just a lot of things that happened to me.
Why do you think you were too
I managed to come out
ignorant?
of it, and some other guys didn't.
Why do you think you were too ignorant?
Well, I just didn't like I said, when I talk about, like, there's a lot of knowledge that the Army has that's purely academic. I'm no more immune to that than anyone else. I didn't understand combat, and I didn't understand, like, why the Army operated the way it did. I thought that the solution was just to basically cut out what I thought was BS and just do what I thought was important, and that wasn't the case. As I've gotten older in the Army, I've begun to appreciate the value in a lot of things that previously I just didn't understand. And I think that it's helped in the way that I lead soldiers. I'm able to articulate to them why these things matter.
Do you feel that this part of your career is something that made you better, or it's something you'd like to erase?
No, it made me exponentially better, because if you have the strength to see the cost and then make the decision to go back in there, like, you've got a wealth of experience that almost nobody in the military has. Like, how many people have been in a unit that has lost during a deployment? And not lost people, I mean functionally, tactically lost. You know what I mean? Like, they gave ground to the enemy. And there's a lot more experience there than any other deployment I ever did. It paid off in my 4th deployment in spades. I was able to lead and accomplish tactical tasks with a certainty that I could only have dreamed about my 2nd deployment.
You mentioned that your initial job there was to clear this road that was loaded with IEDs and bad guys and whatnot, and you talk about losing the ground. If I remember reading correctly, you guys were pulled off that mission, and that road was eventually just given up. Like, they said it was it's not a road we're going to use anymore because there's too many bad guys. Do you look back on that and get angry because you didn't complete your mission, and when you threw your hands up, it almost like everybody who died there dies in vain? Do you feel that way?
No. We don't get to pick. I mean, this is the Army. We don't get to pick what fights we're involved in. Like, part of raising your right hand is saying that, I'm going to fill my spot in the formation, wherever it happens to be. It's unfortunate. I think that the Army, at both the strategic and the tactical level, have a lot to chew on from this, and it may or may not improve, but, the blood that was shed there, like, if the Army pursued it in the right way, it could make improvements in the way that they approach training and socialization of soldiers and officers, like, in a way that would just completely change the culture and make us more effective. Like, all we can do is provide the opportunity, whether the Army or the nation is capable of capitalizing on it or willing to do so. That's not a decision we get to make. It's out of our hands.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting viewpoint. There's a lot of people I've talked to that mission accomplishment that they don't get is what sticks with them the most. That's what bothers them the most because I think a lot of us in the military are just trained to do a job, and we want that job done. And when it doesn't get done, that's regret.
Well, for sure. But I mean, like, when like old armies used to clash in the field and you were part of the losing side, but you got to live, you're no less a veteran than anybody else who was there. I mean, like, your experience in a way is worth more. It's just, at the end of the day, like, idealism will take you a long way. I mean, certainly, like, the pursuit of a mission, it is a noble goal. But, like, when you lose, it takes away the perception that a mission accomplishment is a given, as it is in most of the Army. Like, we are going to accomplish, the Army always wins. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, when you take away that assumption, it gives everything that you do a renewed importance.
No, that's fair, and I certainly, understand where you're coming from, and it's a lucid point that just by surviving, you can make others' sacrifice worth it because there's a story to tell and there's lessons to be learned. And with that point, as a survivor of all this, what do you tell people as your biggest takeaways?
As my biggest what?
As your biggest takeaways from what happened, yeah.
I would say that the one skill that you could ever possibly have that will pay off no matter what you do in life is the ability to filter basically fanciful or false information from correct and accurate, objectively true information. If you can do that and you can see the forest for the trees, you can identify things as they are, not how you want them to be or how you fear them to be, then you're going to be more successful. And I know that sounds maybe trite, but there's a difference between an academic grasp of this information and then like a very visceral possession of it.
No, I think that's fair. I think there's a lot of people in every aspect of their life who see things for what they want them to be, not what they actually are, and whether it's in relationships or in business or anything like that. And your point is well taken that when you can separate the two from what you want it to be and recognize the delta there and the difference, you're probably better off, and you'll end up going a lot farther knowing what you're dealing with then as opposed to what you hope it to be. So one of the things you still do now in the military is you tell this story to people to help educate leadership. I assume you speak to all levels within the military?
Absolutely. I've done like every MACOM commander in the Army at one time with the Secretary of the Army, and then I've done just like battalions, brigades, and companies. So, I mean, every level about.
What do you hope that they get from it?
That they shouldn't buy into their own hype, and that they shouldn't buy into the Army's hype. The Army's only real because we make it real. Like, you cannot touch the Army. You cannot taste the Army. It doesn't really exist it doesn't exist in places unless we bring it there. And it only exists to the level and with the coherence that we bring it. Like, if your battalion is by itself with no oversight and you decide that you're not going to wear tops, then your Army doesn't wear tops. You know what I mean? Like, The Army is what you bring, and it's bigger than us as individuals. We can't lead from a place of individuality. We have to lead from our role in the organization. It's because no individual is worth the loyalty or obedience that they're going to get from their soldiers that's expected of them by their rank. Like, a lieutenant general is in charge of a mind-boggling amount of stuff. What man among us is virtuous enough to be worthy of that kind of authority? And the answer is none. So you just play your role as a lieutenant general, and everything will work out.
I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. I think when you look at it and say, we are given a lot of responsibility in the military, especially in the officer corps. Hey, this is your company. Go ahead, train it, make it work, be great. And that all seems like short, easy tasks, but even when you break it down to even lower levels, as a team leader, I think most of people at your level would feel a sense of responsibility to bring those soldiers that are on your team back home safe and back home alive. And that is a responsibility that is more awesome than anybody can realize, but it's also burdensome at the same time.
Well, I would say it's falsely burdensome, to be honest. Like, the Army didn't deploy you to come home. The Army deployed you to win. And that is the level that I'm talking about. The team leader's job is to support his commander in achieving the mission. His job is not to bring his guys home. Like, that's definitely like something that you want to do, but it's not something. It's not the driving priority of how you plan to do things. And that is a part of the Army that the Army at every level, from my experience, like, cognitively understands this, but emotionally rejects it.
I get that. I do. I'm just processing it here for a second, just because I think sometimes the emotion, and as you said before, believing in your own hype, so to speak, all that takes up a lot of space in the room.
The ability to cut through that will save lives in a way that people can't connect an abstract idea to a way of thinking to actually saving lives. And when I say that, I mean like non-commissioned officers and stuff like that. I mean, at the senior level, of course, they're well acquainted with ideas that save lives. But I mean, even like something this simple and this organic to the organization is just completely alien to most of the people within it.
John, you have any regrets?
I wish I had known on my second deployment what I know now, and maybe I would have been able to make a difference. Maybe I wouldn't have. And I wish that I could impress this information onto the people who need it. But the problem is that the people who need it don't know they need it and have no capacity to appreciate it.
Do you look back on your military career fondly?
Yes. I wouldn't trade it no matter what happens. This has been the highest honor of my life. I've never been more proud to be anything than a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army.
Well, the story is amazing. I commend your courage. I commend your ability to do some of the things you talked about, to see through what doesn't look like reality and recognize what it is and make a very, very tough decision in what was the right decision ultimately, that although it was bad in the public eye and things of that nature, as somebody who wears the same uniform as you do, I thank you for standing up and doing what's right, because ultimately, call me an idealist if you like, I believe that's ultimately what's important, and that is what ultimately will keep our organization strong, is people like you who are willing to do what's right, even though there are others out there who will disagree with those actions. So for that, I personally say thank you for setting the example and just being a man of character.
I appreciate it, of course, and I would just say that, like, it's the organization that socialized me to make that decision. Nothing I did was outside of what the Army expected me to do. That's what I truly believe that a non-commissioned officer was supposed to do, and so there was no decision to make.
Very well said. Staff Sergeant John Diem, thank you so much. Stay well, take care of yourself, and hopefully your message will continue to grow and continue to be heard throughout the rest of the Army.
Have a pleasant day, sir.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.